Buenas tardes. Let me ask you to raise your hand if you have been touched by heart disease. You or someone in your family, your grandfather, anybody had a heart attack, hypertension, heart failure, anything? I'm going to tell you a story of bad news followed by good news. Oops. Here is the bad news. For the entire 20th century, mortality from heart disease was going up and up and up every year. This is the US, but you could just as well put Chile there. It got worse and worse every year over the 20th century. What heart diseases are we talking about? Coronary disease that causes a heart attack, hypertension, stroke, the number one killer of men and women in your country and in mine and around the world. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. For about 20 years, things were getting better. The mortality from heart disease in your country and in mine was declining. If we take this little part of the curve and blow it up, it looks like this. Age-adjusted mortality from heart disease over that period of time, over about 50 years, went down 75%. A spectacular improvement. In that same period, mortality from cancer went down 10%. Why did we see so much robust success? Partly because of new drugs and new devices and new strategies. But most of this stemmed from our understanding of the importance of high blood pressure and obesity and diabetes and exercise and diet. That accounts for the majority of this dramatic improvement. I want to emphasize that cardiovascular diseases are the number one killer of men and women in every country of the world. For women, there's a myth that women don't get heart disease. That is absolutely false. 1 in 4 women will die of heart disease, 1 in 4. Contrast that with breast cancer, which is 1 in 40. A woman is 10 times more likely to die of heart disease than breast cancer. In fact, cardiovascular diseases is a global scourge. It impacts everyone in high-income countries, low- and middle-income countries, all literally around the world. Now, we've made enormous strides in high-income countries such as this one, but in other countries, the atherothrombotic manifestations are on the rise, heart attack and stroke and so forth, in the so-called BRICS countries, Brazil, China, and so forth. The face of cardiovascular diseases is different on different parts of the planet, but it is still the number one killer of men and women globally. Now, important cardiovascular diseases are changing. They're different today than they were 10 years ago, 20, 40 years ago, and importantly, they're going to be different again in the future. If you'll allow me a moment of philosophy, we as physicians, we walk into a patient's room hoping to cure a disease, wipe it off the patient's problem list. I challenge you to tell me how many cardiovascular diseases we can cure. There must be 500 cardiovascular diseases. We can cure some reentrant arrhythmias, we can cure an infection called endocarditis, but in the vast majority of instances, we cannot cure the disease. In fact, that's true of all of medicine. We cannot cure diabetes, we can't cure rheumatoid arthritis. So as physicians, in the great majority of times, we have to settle for the next best thing. If we can't cure a disease that would cause morbidity and mortality, we settle for changing it into a chronic disorder that can be managed for decades. When I was in medical school in the 1980s in a room like this as a first-year student, I heard 2 lectures about a syndrome that was emerging in Northern California and in the country of Haiti, where young men were just having their immune system shut down. They developed crazy infections, rare cancers, and it was a death sentence, an absolute death sentence. It was very scary. It was called the Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS. We had no idea what was causing it, but it was a death sentence. Now, as of 2017, 50% of people with HIV/AIDS are over 50 years of age. We haven't cured HIV/AIDS yet. I believe we will one day. But now it's a chronic disorder that you can live with for decades. How does this pertain to heart disease? If you could take yourself back to the 1950s, if you had a heart attack, the notion was that the heart was injured and there was nothing you could do about it. They would put a patient in a bed, turn the lights down, give him morphine, and watch him for a month. They wouldn't even let you out of bed for 10 days lest you injure the heart more and have a rupture event. In those days, before the advent of the coronary care unit, the way it was treated at that time, which was simply watchful waiting and allowing the heart to heal, the likelihood that you would not go home was 30%. By the 1970s, with the advent of the coronary care unit and the things that go on there, just in 25 years, in-hospital mortality from a heart attack went down by a half. By the 1990s, with antiplatelet therapy, clot buster drugs, percutaneous coronary intervention with balloons and stents, it went down again to 6.5%. How much is it now? What is the mortality in your hospitals here in Santiago from a myocardial infarction? 3%. It was cut in half and cut in half and cut in half. We haven't cured myocardial infarction, and sadly, some people still succumb to it, but in the great majority of instances, we have emergency therapies and amazing drugs, and people usually go home the next day and they're on the golf course the following day. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. There's the bad news. For the last 20 years, we're losing ground. We're backing up for the first time in decades. In fact, it's been said that the millennial generation is the first one in decades that, statistically speaking, will have a shorter lifespan than their parents. We are losing ground. Why is that? Nobody knows exactly, but many people, including me, believe a major driver is the global explosion of obesity. We call it cardiometabolic stress. Obesity is changing the face of our species around the world. Let me point to a study. This is not my own work, but we as a species evolved to die of communicable diseases, cholera, tuberculosis, and things like that. Now, what is the likelihood that a woman will die of a non-communicable disease before the age of 80? A new thing in the history of our species. In every country here, orange and red are bad, green is good. Green is good here in Chile. If you take all of those countries and line them up like little sticks, you can see the likelihood that a woman will die of cardiovascular disease before the age of 80 is very different in some countries than in others. Let me cite an example. In India, a woman now has a 47% chance of dying of a non-communicable disease. They are, in fact, making strides. They're improving, but they're not on track to achieve the World Health Organization objective of 30% decline by 2030. 30 by 30. Here's what China looks like. Here's the US over here, but we are stagnant. We're not making progress. The countries that are doing the very best are here. The countries that are doing the worst are listed there. This is for men. You can see there's a lot more red on there for men. Stacked up like this, you can see that in India, now a man is more likely to die of a non-communicable disease than a communicable disease. Here's China, again, making progress, but not on track. The US for men is 10 points worse. The countries that are doing the very best are here. The countries that are doing the worst are there. So in other words, our species now, for the first time in our history, is dying of cardiovascular, of non-communicable diseases. What diseases are we talking about? We're talking about heart disease. For the first time in the history of our species, heart disease has changed the face of the future of Homo sapiens. We live in what some people call a syndemic, a synergy of epidemics, driven by metabolic stress and obesity, visceral adiposity, leading to a variety of diseases, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and so forth, each with its own mortality signal. And where obesity lives is where diabetes lives. With a little bit of an exaggeration or simplification, an obese person will develop diabetes eventually. 20 years later, that person will have heart disease and succumb to it. Most people with diabetes die of heart disease. And hypertension is also a major part of this. A very famous cardiologist named Eugene Braunwald, who's 95 years old and who's a mentor of mine, said to me once that the thrombocardiologists of the 20th century dealing with acute thrombus in the coronary arteries will be replaced by the diabetocardiologist of the 21st century. So, for the early career people in the room, I urge you to think about where things are going. I hope I've convinced you that they're very different now than they were 10, 20, 50 years ago. Be sure to skate to where the puck is going to be. The cardiovascular puck will be in a different place 10 years from now, 20, 50 years from now, than it is now. The future. First of all, heart failure is a syndrome. It's a syndrome that's caused by approximately 500 different diseases, and we take them all, this is heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. We take all these different diseases, we throw them in a jar and call it heart failure and treat it all the same. Many of us dream of a day where we'll have disease-specific mechanisms for all these different various diseases that ultimately culminate in a syndrome called heart failure. Importantly, atherosclerosis begins when you're 8 years old. Not because little kiddies are developing atherosclerotic plaque, but rather they're learning not to take care of themselves, not to exercise, not to eat right, to spend too much time in front of a screen, ultimately leading to obesity and hypertension and so forth. So the focus in the future is going to be on primordial prevention. We heard about that in the speech that preceded me. Learning about risk factors that we learn at an early age that ultimately culminate in hypertension and obesity and so forth. To address that, social determinants of health, how we have access to health care, economic stability, all these things are different in every country. It's different in Chile than it is in the US, than it is in China. Every country, every domain has to address this specifically in a context-specific fashion. We heard a little bit in the previous talk about genetics and genomics. You may be aware that every single one of us in this room is predisposed a little bit toward having heart disease or a little bit away from having heart disease based on the genes that we inherited from our parents. Nothing we can do about that. And so people are developing polygenic risk scores to try to figure out who is predisposed to heart disease and who is not. Winston Churchill, for example, who led the UK charge against Hitler in World War II, he had a BMI of 40. He ate meat 3 meals a day, and he had a cigar in his mouth all day long. And yet he lived to be 80 years old. You know, he had a good polygenic risk score. So machine learning, we heard a little bit about that, is already changing our world, and it certainly is changing the way we deal with our patients and the way we do research at a whole host of ways. The blockchain, you're aware, is a globally distributed and encrypted way in which all of human information gleaned over millennia is in every cell phone in this room in an encrypted fashion. Wearable technology is something that's present as well. iPS cell technology, if you're not familiar with this, I could see Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith in clinic on Tuesday afternoon, draw a blood sample from them, turn their white blood cells into stem cells called induced pluripotent stem cells, and then tell those cells, I want you to become heart cells. So now I have Mr. Jones's heart cells in a dish and Mr. Smith's heart cells in a dish. And we can study drugs, we can test for efficacy, we can test for toxicity, we can personalize medicine, which is something that has been elusive in cardiology because we don't routinely sample the myocardium. In cancer, they sample the biopsy of the tumor. In infectious diseases, they grow up the bug. We don't do that routinely because it's dangerous, but now we have technologies such that we can have individual person's heart tissue in a dish. And using fancy omic strategies, pharmacogenomics, proteomics, and epigenomics, we will be able to glean novel insights, molecular subphenotypes, and precision medicine going forward. Inflammation, just briefly, inflammation for 40 or 50 years has been a theoretical concept in many different heart diseases. That changed in 2017, just 9 years ago, with a publication called the CANTOS trial, which for the first time showed that a single nuclear strike, a surgical strike on a single pathway was sufficient to provide mortality benefit. It was like a thunderclap across the field. Now this is that pathway just illustrated here, starting with this molecule up here, leading to IL-18 and so forth, inflammatory cytokines. Already drugs have been approved to treat this pathway just in the last 8 years, and others are being considered. CHIP, another concept, is that each one of us in this room has hematopoietic stem cells that are constantly dividing all the time. Every once in a while, one clone will mutate and it will divide a little bit faster than its neighbors and begin to overpopulate the blood supply. That's called clonal hematopoiesis of indeterminate potential. By the time you're 70, 10% of people have CHIP. By the time you're 80, 40% of people have CHIP. And we know now for sure that it is associated with cardiovascular diseases in 3 different pathways that I don't have time to discuss. CRISPR-Cas9 now technology where we are actually now altering the human genome, and we do this in the laboratory all the time. A molecule called LDL, bad cholesterol, is governed by another molecule called PCSK9. If you target that one gene with a molecule that ignores the other 23,000 genes in our genome, PCSK9 levels drop to the floor and LDL levels drop precipitously as well. There are companies that are pursuing this and other molecules, one called angiopoietin-like 3, transthyretin, other things. We are now altering the human genome in our patients. Telehealth is something we all do regularly. Xenotransplantation, you may know that for everybody who gets a heart transplant, 4 people needed it and died of it because there are not enough hearts to donate. And so people are working using CRISPR technologies to humanize the pig genome, thereby, I believe, ameliorating this problem. Why pigs? Why do that in pigs? First of all, pigs grow really fast. They're about the size of a human being, and they make 10 babies, rather than a monkey makes just 1. And you may be aware that several years ago, a man in Baltimore, Maryland, received a pig heart. That's been done now twice. This is done pretty regularly now in kidneys and so forth. The last thing I'll talk about briefly is the metagenome. Every one of us in this room is carrying 3 kilograms of bugs in our gut, 3 kilograms. And the spectrum of bugs that you're carrying depends on who you live with, what you eat, do you have a pet, and it's different for every one of us. And what is crystal clear is that when your heart suffers pathological stress, it knows what is in your gut. In fact, it goes both directions. The gut talks to the heart, and the heart talks to the gut. The final thing is something that's really out there. There's a company in Northern California populated by brilliant scientists who are very well funded, and they are testing the hypothesis that there's no reason why the human body should wear out by the age of 90. They believe that by targeting senescence biology, we'll see, it sounds like science fiction, that maybe people could live to be 100, 120, 150, and so forth. So the point I would like to make and emphasize is that cardiovascular diseases is the #1 killer of men and women around the world, but there's never been a more exciting time with the tools at our disposal to address this. As physicians, we will take care of heart disease however it presents, but the ultimate solution will be at the level of research. I thank you for your attention.